Здравствуйте, welcome back to Russian Theory Poems and Paintings. Today's day 131, and we're switching gears a little bit here in the book away from just basically pure grammar to some more vocabulary and some more sort of open discussion and free response to questions about feelings. So thoughts, feelings, expressing basic ideas, basic feelings is sort of the focus of this chapter. And then, of course, in the following chapter, we'll move on to read some literature, and that'll give us some new context in which to discuss how the characters are feeling, what they're thinking, and so on. So, of course, as we do this, we're going to review some grammar, some really important points of grammar, sort of in the context of expressing ideas and feelings and whatnot. Okay, so today we're focusing on feelings and uses of the reflexive particle. So there's a really big topic that we've covered in some depth. So let's just quickly review that with some examples. So we call this the reflexive particle, even though it doesn't always convey reflexivity, right? Of course, it can, right? And in that case, we would say that it's reflexive in meaning, right? A verb that has this reflexive particle. So, for example, we could have возвращаться, вернуться, which means to return. And then, by the way, remember the general problem so often with this reflexive particle is that it accounts for a distinction in Russian that isn't always present in English. So, for example, if we see these two verbs, возвращаться, вернуться, with the reflexive particle, and возвращать, вернуть, without the particle, we see the English translation for both is to return, right? So the obvious question is, what's the difference? Well, as we know, the one with the reflexive particle is intransitive. Also, here in this case, can be understood as reflexive. Whereas the one without the particle is transitive, meaning it can take a direct object. So, for example, you can return a book to the library. That would be вернуть in Russian. Or you can, if we understand it literally, you can return yourself to a location, meaning you're going back there, you're returning to a certain location in an intransitive sense. That would be вернуться in Russian. For example, Ярмарка вернулась наконец в наш город. So the fair has returned to our city. And there's a quick painting there, Yarmarka by Kustodiev. Somewhat unusual painting there by him. It's not quite like his usual style, but it does depict this, Russian life right here at the fair. Right, so Yarmarka вернулась наконец в наш город. It has returned, right? It has come back. Again, we could maybe think of that in a reflexive sense that it hasn't returned something else, but rather it's returned itself. It's come back. Now, as you can tell, that sometimes we may be able to think of a reflexive verb in a certain sort of literal sense, right, as being literally reflexive, and that may not always work completely, right? I mean, the fair returned itself, right? That does sound rather stilted. And of course, we would never translate the verb in that way, in this case at least. But it does help us maybe to imagine why the reflexive particle is appearing in the Russian. So compare that to «Надо вернуть украденную куклу продавцу», right? We need to return the stolen doll to the salesman. I'm speculating that this little girl stole the doll, but I don't know. Maybe she's a little shoplifter. Maybe her mom bought it for her. But anyway, so she has to return the doll, right? The doll is a direct object of the verb, and so we would say that вернуть is transitive. It can take an object. Okay, what about another pair here? Продаваться, продаться versus продавать, продать. Okay, again, the one without the particle is transitive, meaning it can take an object, right? Can you sell something? Of course, right? That means that to sell in English is transitive, and its Russian equivalent is продавать, продать without the particle. But we can add the particle, and in this case, I mean, of course, it could mean to sell yourself to the devil, I guess. I don't know that, but obviously that's a little bit weird, right? That reflexive meaning. So often this verb would mean to be sold, right? And here we get our second major meaning of the reflexive particle, passivity, right? Not to do something, but to have something done to you, right? Passive, right? So на ярмарке продается практически все. Almost practically everything is sold, passive, at the fair. So the second verb here, right, is transitive, right? Again, in Russian without the particle, продавать, продать. Здесь продают кукол, грабли и ведра. right? So here they sell dolls, rakes, and buckets. And by the way, this, if you remember, I believe in book one, we first learned this construction, right? Third plural verb telling us what people do, literally what they do, right? Продают, and that's sometimes called a passive in quotation marks, third plural passive, quote unquote, right? Now, if we look at this, we see that it's actually active, literally, right? In terms of the grammar, we have an active form of the verb, obviously, but because the subject is this sort of anonymous they, right? And we see the subject and the verb ending only, продают, right? We don't include они. We simply say здесь продают, meaning they sell. That kind of verb form, even though it's active, it draws attention away from the subject of the verb, right? From any particular subject. And so it's often called a sort of pseudo-passive construction. That would be a lot like saying in English, dolls are sold here, right? Buckets are sold here. Здесь продают ведра. By the way, a kukol there, that's kind of a funny, kukla is the actual noun, the nominative, but it's treated often as an animate noun, right? I guess because the little girls talk about them as though they were an actual, a living thing, animate, right? So that's why we have kukol here instead of kukli in the accusative. Okay, third meaning. So we've covered already the two major meanings of the reflexive particle, right? Reflexivity, passivity. Those are the first two you'd try to, you'd think about if you're analyzing a verb. The final two are less common. Reciprocity means that two or more people or whatever are doing something to each other, right? So compare видеться, увидеться, right? Now, again, we could, depending on the context, we could try interpreting this in various ways, right? Видеться could maybe mean to see oneself reflexively. It could mean to be seen, right? Passive meaning. Or it can mean to see each other, right? Reciprocity. For example, мы опять увидимся на следующей ярмарке, right? We'll see each other again, right? We'll see each other, reciprocity at the next fair. Again, verses without the ся, we would just have a simple transitive verb. Мы всегда очень рады вас видеть, right? We're already very glad to see you, right? Вас, again, we have a direct object, that's transitive. Okay, the fourth meaning is the I guess probably the least common and also kind of the most vague, right? So this is in some ways a catch-all for some various verbs, some of which are extremely common, for which we can't really explain the ся in terms of any of the first three meanings we've just discussed. So I call this the spontaneity category. We actually had a really great example in a poem for which I'll do a separate video, but it was earlier here in the book, the Lermontov poem Son, where we saw the verb дымиться, which means to smoke, right? To be giving off smoke, right? And so clearly that's not an active verb in the way you could say I smoked a cigarette, right? I smoked a cigarette, but rather this kind of, and it's also not passive, right? It's not that something is being smoked. That doesn't make much sense, at least not in the context of the poem, right? It's not number three, reciprocity. No one's smoking each other. Right, so we're left with this number four where smoke is kind of spontaneously coming out of the gunshot wound, if you remember the poem, right? It's smoking, it's giving off smoke in a way that seems sort of spontaneous, right? There's not any clear sense of agency at all, right? So we also get this with a lot of really common verbs that involve feelings, right? And again, I think it's fairly useful to imagine these as feelings that sort of arise spontaneously. Things like fear, or also reactions like laughter, right? Laughing, smiling, things that we don't necessarily do on purpose. Of course, we can do it on purpose, but again, those Russian verbs are always used with the ся. And here are three examples: бояться, смеяться, улыбаться, улыбнуться. I think these verbs are almost all new for us, right? And note again that these cannot be used without the particle, right? So, in so many cases, all the ones we've seen so far, you could use it with or without the particle. Of course, it would change the meaning. But for so many of these spontaneity examples, you can't use the verb without the ся ever, right? So, бояться, there is no verb боять, right, ever in Russian. Okay, so let's practice these verbs, really common, verbs. Я боюсь пауков. We see that this verb takes the genitive, right, чего, there in the markup. Смеяться над чем or nad kем means to laugh at something, literally to laugh above or over someone or something. Они смеются надо мной. And finally, улыбаться, улыбнуться. And I think I ran out of room there. Should have put чему, right? You're laughing at something. We get the dative in Russian. Чему ты улыбаешься? What are you smiling at, or what are you smiling about? Quick review on pronunciation. This is really important because these reflexive verbs are so common, and we've been over this, but students often forget that any reflexive form that has a t at the end of the Russian form, right? So that could be the infinitive, like boyatsa, or the third singular boyitsa, or the third plural boyatsa, right? All those three forms are the ones that have a t. And in that case, we don't say what we're actually writing on the page, right? So we don't say bayatsya, baitsya, bayatsya. Instead, we have kind of a simplified form with tsa, simply tsa and not sya, right? Bayatsa, baitsa, bayatsa, right? So follow there in the book, right? What we're actually saying can be spelled very easily in Russian, and note that while it's not too extreme of a difference, it is an important difference. Now keep in mind that all other forms that don't have the te, they would be pronounced as written, right? So these are the only three exceptions that are relevant here. Okay, so let's now look at a few verbs that always include the particle. I think most of these are new. Again, we're getting some new vocabulary having to do with feelings, right? So boyatsa, смеяться, гордиться, чем, right? And so many of these are taking some case other than the nominative, right? Стыдиться, чего, right? Taking the genitive. Стараться, постараться, пытаться, попытаться, улыбаться, улыбнуться, right? And we've had a couple of those trying verbs already, but again, they're always used with the particle. And finally, надеяться, right? Надеюсь, надеешься, etc. That's an a verb. So there we go. Okay, let's practice these patterns, right? Some of these verbs are a bit unusual. Let's take бояться, which is a ja verb. And this is especially kind of confusing because remember, in our verb tag ja, the ja can stand in for a hushing consonant or an ikratkaya. And that's the variation we have here. Boyatsa, that verb is built off ikratkaya a, right? And that's why, of course, we're seeing in the actual Russian ya. Okay, and remember that ja verbs take e endings, right? If you remember that, this isn't too difficult. Я боюсь, ты боишься, они боятся. Number two, смеяться is an a verb, meaning it's going to be taking the your endings. And this, again, is kind of a variation we don't see every day, where the consonant before the a is an ikratkaya, right? Not some other consonant like the z in сказать, or so many of these other a verbs we've seen that have a consonant at the end of the stem, right? So we get here in stress, смеюсь, смеешься, смеются. Number three, also an a verb, but here stress on the stem. Надеюсь, надеешься, надеются. Okay, let's try a few simple sentences. And again, we have to be really careful with a lot of these to get the case right. They're taking some object in a case other than the accusative. So we have to watch out. My sister is afraid of dogs. Okay, we see бояться takes the genitive, чего, right? Моя сестра боится собак. Собак, genitive plural. Number two, the other students laughed at my answer. Okay, so let's use смеяться над plus the instrumental. Другие студенты смеялись над моим ответом. Над моим ответом. Okay, number three, the parents are proud of their children, so we want to use гордиться, погордиться plus instrumental, right? Чем. Родители гордятся своими детьми. 4, he is ashamed of his accent. Okay, стыдится, we see that takes чего, right, the genitive. Он стыдится своего акцента, genitive. Number 5, I try to do everything on time. Okay, kind of in the sense of striving, right? We have two different verbs here. Стараться means to strive to do something. Пытаться just simply means to attempt something. It's a little bit less emphatic. So I try to do everything on time. Я стараюсь все делать вовремя. Right, I try to do everything on time generally. Я стараюсь. 6. I'm trying to open this bottle of wine. Okay, this is an attempt. Я пытаюсь открыть эту бутылку вина. Я стараюсь открыть, right? Both of those can take the infinitive just like in English, right? To try to do something. 7. That baby is smiling at you. Этот ребенок тебе улыбается. Улыбается, which takes the dative. 8. I hope I'll be in Russia this summer. Я надеюсь, что я буду в России этим летом. Okay, next item. This is something that is quite simple, but it's extremely useful, especially for a lot of verbs that involve feelings. We can basically take an active verb and make it passive or vice versa, again, by adding or subtracting the reflexive particle. And just to take one example, pugать is pugать means to frighten, right? Well, almost any verb like that, right, that would make sense in a passive sense, like to frighten. Well, certainly one can frighten someone else, or one can be frightened passively. Almost any verb like that, you can, almost without hesitation, add a reflexive particle and get a corresponding passive verb. Like pugatse is pugatse, to be frightened. And again, especially when you're talking about emotions and things like this, or almost anything else really, this is an extremely regular feature of Russian grammar. Now, of course, there may be some weird exceptions where a certain form isn't really used very often, so you might want to check a dictionary, but the ones here in the exercise are all used like this. And this is something to watch for when you're reading a literary text, right? For example, in my book, we may see a passive form, right? For example, to be frightened, but I'll give you the active, just the simple pugать is pugать, to frighten, and it would be up to you to interpret that to, in a passive sense, and see that a given form means to be frightened with the reflexive particle. So, for example, сними эту ужасную маску, ты так меня испугал. Right? You frightened me so, right? You gave me such a fright. Ты меня испугал. Right? That's transitive. Okay, now it's an active, so let's now make it passive. Я так испугался. Right? I was frightened. I got frightened. I was frightened. Правда, я очень легко пугаюсь. But I am frightened very easily, right? Passive. I get frightened. I am frightened. Okay, so let's take some active pairs, right, without the particle. We'll see their meaning. A lot of these are new, and we'll simply create or we'll add the reflexive particle to get a new passive pair and practice using it in a sentence. So this is pretty simple, but it's really, really useful. Okay, so удивить means to surprise. We add the particle, we get удивляться, удивиться, which means to be surprised. And we see that here in this, with the particle, it can take чему, meaning to be surprised at something. Now keep in mind that the vast majority of these verbs, when they're not used with the particle, they're gonna, like any verb, right, we would assume they would take direct objects in the accusative, right? So that's kind of our default assumption, right? And that would be true of, I think, all of these verbs, including удивлять, удивить, right? You can surprise someone, right? Okay, now let's look at this sentence, and we have to watch out because the sentences here may be passive or active, right? So we've got to judge, do we need the reflexive particle or not? You surprise me. Ты меня удивляешь, right? You surprise me. We have a direct object. We need the active verb, right? Present tense. Ты меня удивляешь. Okay, compare that to we were surprised by what he did. Okay, this is obviously going to be passive. Мы удивились тому, что он сделал. Мы удивились тому, right? Plus the dative. Okay, next verb, обижать, обидеть, to offend. Again, we can offend someone. That would be accusative case. Or we can create a passive verb meaning to be offended, to get offended. Обижаться, обидеться. Okay, I think we offended him. По-моему, мы его обидели. Right? We need an active form. Of course, he gets offended very easily. He is offended. That's passive. Правда, он очень легко обижается. Обижается. Next verb, расстраивать, расстроить, to upset someone, right? To get upset, to be upset, passive would be расстраиваться, расстроиться. The results of the election have upset me terribly. Результаты выборов меня ужасно. Okay, let's think. Расстроили, right? Again, we have a direct object, меня. We need the active verb. Результаты меня расстроили. I always get upset when I watch the news. Okay, passive. Я всегда расстраиваюсь, когда я смотрю новости. Успокаивать, успокоить, to calm someone, right? To calm them down. Versus успокаиваться, успокоиться, which means to be calmed, right? To calm down. There's an example. There are so many of these in English, right? You could say, I calmed him down. And you can also say, he's calming down, right? Or I'm calming down, right? So what happens so often in English is we use or we at least can use the exact same verb form for both transitive and intransitive, right? And that weak, our rather weak understanding of transitivity in English grammar is what causes problems when we go to choose in Russian between whether to use the particle or not, right? So again, a clear distinction is always being made in Russian that may not always be made so clearly in English. Okay, so to be calmed down, or to calm down simply, intransitive, успокаиваться, успокоиться. The mother spent a long time calming her son down. Мать долго успокаивала своего сына, right? She, for a long time, imperfective, was calming him down, or we could say trying to calm him down. Finally, he calmed down and stopped crying. Okay, now this is going to be, we could think of this more literally as he was calmed down, right, by his mother, right? So we need the passive meaning here. Наконец он успокоился и перестал плакать. Волновать, взволновать means to upset or to agitate. Волноваться, взволноваться means to get upset, to be upset. Mom gets upset when we come home late. Мама волнуется, когда мы возвращаемся поздно. Okay, our behavior has been worrying her. Okay, here we have a direct object. We don't need the particle. Наше поведение ее волнует в последнее время. Right, it's been worrying her, and it's still worrying her. So we keep present tense here in the Russian. Okay, 6. Запутывать, запутать means to confuse something. Запутываться, запутаться means to be confused, to get confused, and we could say in something. That would be the idiom. В чем? This construction always confuses me. Эта конструкция меня всегда запутывает. It always confuses me. I'm totally confused. Let's just use past tense. Я совсем запутался. Right, I've gotten all confused. Я совсем запутался. Perfective. 7. Стеснять. This means literally to make tight, to make cramped, to constrict, and by extension to feel embarrassed, to feel uncomfortable, to feel shy. Okay, so from this, which is imperfective, well, usually it's only in the imperfective, at least in this sense, we would get стесняться, right, meaning to be embarrassed, to be made shy by something, right, instrumental. We're embarrassed to speak Russian. Мы стесняемся говорить по-русски. Why won't you speak what's making you shy? Почему ты не говоришь, что тебя стесняет? What's making you feel awkward? What's embarrassing you, etc. Okay, so that final verb has really, all of these verbs here in the exercise are fairly common. And again, we have to watch as to whether or not we're using the reflexive particle. Okay, let's look at a few more examples here with deverbals, right? We're going to continue to practice deverbals in this little unit here. Let's first look at a painting, a rather famous one by Nikolai G. Петр I допрашивает царевича Алексея Петровича в Петергофе. So this is Peter the Great interrogating his own son, and he would eventually, by the way, torture him to death for various reasons, the main one being that he had expressed a dislike for the new capital city Peter had created, Petersburg, and was intimating that he would move the capital back to Russia when he became Tsar. So let's read the caption. Как мы знаем, Петр Великий провел много реформ в России. Right, as we know, Peter the Great carried out, or literally he led through, a lot of reforms in Russia. Царевич Алексей был недоволен реформами своего отца. But the Tsarevich, Alexei, was not happy. He wasn't satisfied with the reforms of his father. Петр подозревал, что сын планирует захват власти. Peter suspected that his son is planning, or was planning, we'd say in English, a seizure of power, right? A coup, a takeover. Здесь идет допрос, right? Here, an interrogation is underway, questioning is underway. Как себя чувствует молодой царевич? Right? How does the young царевич feel himself, literally, right? What's he feeling during this discussion? We're going to use a couple of verbs here. Убеждать, убедить, which would mean to convince someone. We can make those passive and get a verb, for example, убедиться, which would mean to convince oneself or to be convinced. Right? Убедиться. Another one, обвинять, обвинить, means to accuse someone, and then passively understood, that would be обвиняться, обвиниться, to be accused of something, passive. So let's think about the painting and just translate a few sentences here with different verb forms. Some of these are deverbals. И отец и сын ужасно взволнованы. Right, both father and son are terribly upset, terribly agitated, right? That's a short form PPP. Петр убедился, что Алексей планирует захват власти. Okay, there's the passive, right? He has become convinced. He has been convinced. We could say he's convinced himself. I guess that would actually make some sense as well, right? Understanding this reflexively. But in any case, he's convinced that Alexei is planning a coup. 3. Алексей удивлен... Sorry, I didn't realize that was a question at first. Алексей удивлен этими обвинениями. Is Alexei surprised by these accusations? Okay, again, there's a PPP, right? A passive participle followed by the instrumental, right? Is he surprised by these accusations? Алексей испугался, не боится ли? So, again, there's our verb we just learned. Is he frightened, right? Has he been frightened by this predicament, right? Не боится ли? Is he not afraid? 5. Ведь он обвиняется в измене, right? After all, he's being accused. He is accused of treachery, right? Of being a traitor. Измена. Treason, right? We could say, of course. 6. Он сумеет убедить отца в своей невиновности. Will he manage to convince his father in his innocence, literally? And that's the idiom there. To убедить в чем. Now again, there he wants to convince his father, right? So we have a direct object, active verb, убедить. 7. Нет, не сумеет. Он скоро умрет под пытками. No, he will not manage to convince his father. He will soon die, literally under tortures, right? Meaning while being tortured. Okay, on that happy note, by the way, Russian history is rarely, a walk in the park. There's many, many dark chapters. Okay, anyway, so again, on that note, we'll call it a day and continue with feelings and ideas and thoughts and more review of grammar on day 132. Until then, до свидания.